Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I am here to help you sleep better with true horror stories. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like my video. I would love to know where you are from and what time you're watching this video. So please leave a comment to let me know, and I will draw from that experience to tell even better stories. When you are ready, feel free to relax. I live in an RV, constantly journeying across the country. However, a few months each year, I settle in one place to save some money before moving on. At that time, I found myself in southern Utah, working a gas station situated on a road primarily used by locals to bypass freeway traffic. This route was quiet, with just the gas station catering to occasional travelers, making it an ideal job for me since the location was of little concern. It's one of the intriguing aspects of a life on wheels. I decided to stay and work there for a while. After a little over a month, I was still on random shifts, and that day I was scheduled from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. It wasn't an extraordinary night by any stretch, but like all the others, there were hardly any customers, save for a couple who briefly visited the pumps. There wasn't much to occupy my time. I mostly found myself standing around, scrolling through my phone or tidying up the shelves. However, around 1 a.m., something shifted. A customer pulled into the station parking lot in one of the few spaces right in front of the door. Seeing him, I went back to the counter to serve, and the man got out of his car and walked into the STO. He looked at me, smiled, and then nodded. I nodded back, and he continued down one of the aisles. As I was checking the grocery aisle, the man started whistling as he looked at a couple of things pick. ING them up and putting them back, then continued down the next aisle and repeated that same action. I wasn't sure if he was just taking a break from driving or if he really needed something, but the items he was picking up and looking at were all different, and he didn't really seem interested in buying them. Then he abruptly stopped whistling, walked over to the door, and left at the time I didn't think he stole anything, but it was strange. The guy got into his car, and through the windshield, which had no smoke paper on it, I could see that he started looking for something in the back seat before getting back out of his car and walking back into the store after seeing what he had just done. I didn't feel too comfortable. I didn't know what it was he had been looking for in the back seat or why he had returned to the store. I wanted to think that maybe he had left his wallet there and that was what he had gone out to get, but I wasn't too convinced, as judging by his odd attitude, this seemed almost exactly how I thought an armed robbery would start. However, the assault I expected when he re-entered the store didn't happen. Instead, he approached the counter and asked me how my night was going to start. ING, a quick back and forth of small talk. I acted as normally as I could, trying to disguise the fact that I was overthinking everything. But then he asked me if I could help him with his car set. His tires needed air, and that he didn't see any pumps outside the station. The truth is I didn't have any air pumps at the gas station, but I did carry a handheld air compressor for emergency situations, so I pulled it out and followed him to his car. He pointed down to where the tire was that needed air, and I bent down, placing the line on the compressor. I had it there for less than 10 seconds while I REA'd the pressure, which turned out to be at the correct level. I then looked up at the man to tell him the tire was okay, but when I did, what I saw was his fist coming straight for my face. I fell to the ground stunned and tried to get up, but then the man started kicking me wildly. I started screaming at him to stop, curling up on the ground and covering my head with my arms, try to protect myself, but he kept kicking me mercilessly and without giving me a chance at anything. The way he was doing it was so brutal. I felt each blow as if I was being hit with a hammer, and I really thought it was the end of me. Finally, the man stopped kicking me, and as I lay on the ground in pain, motionless and barely half conscious, I watched in horror as he pulled a knife from his belt and in a swift manner and without any hesitation whatsoever put it to my neck and slid it from side to side. This happened in a split second, but to me it felt like it was in slow motion, as I could feel the edge of the blade on every millimeter of my skin. Instinctively, I brought my hands to the wound, trying to hold back the gushing blood, but I knew it was useless. No one survives a cut to the jugular, so I just stood there in a fetal position, looking out into the darkness of the deserted road ahead, bleeding out, as the guy walked calmly towards the store. I don't know how much time passed, but I began to hear the man's footsteps Croaking, I was still conscious, although I didn't know for how much longer. In fact, I was surprised that I hadn't died, yet as I understood that a cut in the neck meant a quick death, and although I was sure that my death was imminent anyway, the survival instinct is something that just doesn't go out as long as I had some life left. So I decided to close my eyes and play dead when I heard him approach. Standing there, I could hear the man put a bunch of stuff inside the van. You could hear the sound of the items bumping into each other and being piled in the back seat. Then I heard him stop his STE. PS to the side of me. I knew he was looking at me. I could feel it. So I held my breath and stood as still as I could. A couple of seconds later, I heard him get into the truck, turn it on, and felt the tire brush against me as I backed out of the parking lot. I heard the car pull out of the spot and onto the highway. And when I stopped hearing the engine, I got up off the ground as best I could still sing my neck with my hands and walked toward the store, dizzy, and staggering. I couldn't believe I was still alive, even though I felt so weak and dizzy that I knew I would pass out at any moment. Still in the middle of the mess the man had left, I managed to see my cell phone still placed next to the cash register, which was now open, and with a pile of coins strewn about, I dialed 911, and with my last thread of consciousness, I told them as briefly as I could where I was, and that my throat had been cut. That's the last thing I remember before everything went dark, and I was completely UNC. Conscious when I opened my eyes again, I was in a hospital bed with a nurse injecting something into the hose attached to the back of my left hand. Immediately after she looked at me, she began to call TH. Doctor. Immediately, the memories of what happened began to hit me, and then I brought my hands to my neck and realized that I was bandaged. I honestly could not believe that I was alive, and I was very grateful for that, because surviving, that was a possibility I never thought about. In fact, when I called 911, what was going through my mind was that I wanted them to find my body and inform my family of my death. I later learned that probably because I was overweight, the knife did not penetrate deep enough to cut any major veins, and although it came very close, it never reached the jugular vein. And the T was the only reason I was alive, because the man miscalculated where he made the cut. I have no words to describe how grateful I am to be alive, but without a doubt this experience was enough to never work the night shift again, much less alone in the middle of music. Nowhere 10 years ago, I was working a night shift at a 24-hour restaurant. This job had its ups and downs. The pay was decent, and the hours were long and quiet. The place had a steady stream of regular truckers and the occasional night owl craving a cup of coffee and a slice of pie to sweeten the night. I had been working there for about a year, and my shift started at 11 p.m. and persisted until 7 a.m. I had been working there for about a year. It was a small restaurant, and most nights it was just him, the cook, a gruff man in his 50s, and me, responsible for serving customers and taking their orders. One of our regulars was a man named David. He was around 40, stocky, bald, with a thick beard, and he had a habit of wearing the same brown leather jacket every time he came in. David was somewhat reclusive. He usually sat at the counter, sipping his coffee and staring into the void. He never caused any trouble and came in a couple of times a week, always at the same time, between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m. He would order the same thing, sit in the same place, and after an hour or two leave. David was one of those custom customers you get used to. However, about a month ago, something had changed. He started to come more frequently. It was no longer every 2 or 3 nights. He came every night and sat at the counter. But now, instead of looking into the void, he started to look at me, but it wasn't a casual look. It was more of an insistent look, a look that followed me everywhere, almost without blinking. At first, I ignored it. I was used to dealing with my share of lonely night shift customers who wanted to chat, and I assumed David had finally decided to join the club. At first, he was subtle, asking me how I was doing, if I was tired, if I ever got scared working alone at night. His questions were a bit personal. I answered them politely, not wanting to be rude, but then he started leaving bigger tips, $10 to $20 one time. He even left me $50, all for a cup of coffee and a slice of cake. Not that I was complaining. But my experience told me that that kind of generosity from a man is never selfless. One night, after I refilled his coffee, he came a little closer and said, "You're too pretty to work in a place like T. Is at night, you never know who might come over." I laughed at the time, but I didn't really find his comment funny, and the way he said it made my skin crawl. I tried to avoid him after that, keeping my conversation short and to the point, but he kept coming back, and his behavior got stranger one night. He came in with a small gift and necklace. He handed it to me with a smile that made me uneasy. This, and it reminded me of you, he said. I hesitated to accept it. I politely told him I couldn't receive it and thanked him for taking the trouble, but he insisted on placing it on the counter in front of me. I left it there hoping he would retrieve it when he left, but he didn't. After he left, I threw it in the trash. A few nights later, things took a darker turn one day, around 3 a.m. The restaurant was empty, except for David, who was sitting in his usual spot at the counter. Hay was in the back taking a smoke break, and I was wiping down the counter, trying to ignore the way David's yes followed me everywhere. Suddenly, David broke the silence with a thought that crossed his mind. He commented on how easy it would be to subdue someone like me in a place like this. The mere suggestion scared me and sent a shiver down my back. My hand tightly clenched the rag I was using to clean, and David smiled, but there was nothing friendly in that smile. I understood exactly what he said, being aloe. And here most nights, I was vulnerable to anyone with bad intentions, and the thought of what could happen if someone decided to hurt me felt terribly real. I forced a laugh, trying to take it as a joke. He didn't respond. He just kept looking at me, and his smile never wavered. After what seemed like an eternity, he finished his coffee, left a large bill on the counter, and walked out without another word. Stood there for a long time after he left, staring at the door, my mind racing as I remembered his haunting words and the strange moment I had just had with this man. I knew I had to do something. I had to tell someone, hey, the police, someone, but I didn't want to make a big fuss out of nothing, so I decided not to let myself get paranoid and put the matter aside. The next night, David didn't show up at the restaurant for the first time in weeks. I felt a sense of relief so great I can't even describe it. I thought maybe he had finally gotten the message and decided to leave me alone, but just as I was the register, the phone rang. I picked it up, expecting it to be hey or a late-night order, but instead there was only silence on the other end of the line. I was about to hang up when suddenly I heard a low, hoarse sigh followed by David's voice. Did you miss me? He whispered into the phone. I hung up with a jolt and looked around the restaurant in panic, expecting to see him standing outside, but the parking lot was empty. I ran to the back, found him, and told him what happened. He tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just a joke. The next night and the next were the same. There was no sign of David in the place, but the phone calls continued. Each time it was the same silence, and then David's voice saying something creepy that gave me goosebumps. I knew I couldn't go on like this. My anxiety was through the roof. I could barely sleep. I was nervous all the time, and I began to dread my shifts at the restaurant. I told him about the calls, but there wasn't much he could do. The police didn't take it seriously either, and said they couldn't do much without more concrete evidence than a phone call. I felt really desperate and very helpless, as it seemed that no one could do anything for me. This man's attitude was starting to seriously worry me. One night, after several weeks of just calling, David came back to the restaurant. It was around 3 a.m. Just as before, I was wiping down the counter, trying not to think about the phone calls, when the door creaked open. I looked up, and there he was standing in the doorway. I swear at that moment, I just wanted to run and lock myself in the back room. But I didn't. I was frozen in the same spot. David walked up to the counter, sat down across from me, and asked me why I hadn't answered his calls. I stepped back, trying to create some space between us, but the distance offered little comfort, and told him to go away. He replied that he wasn't going anywhere until he got what he wanted. In answer to I promised nothing but danger. I began to panic and looked back in hopes that Haim would return, but the door remained closed, and I was alone. I tried to reach for the phone to call the police, but D moved faster, and his hand shot out, grabbing my wrist. I knew I had to get away from him. So with my free hand, I grabbed the coffee pot off the counter, then planted it on his head with such force that he let go of my wrist and began to stagger. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I just ran out to the back room, screaming at the top of my lungs for help and calling for Hay. When we both got back to the front, David was gone. The police took my report more seriously after that, especially when they saw the bruise on my wrist. They searched the area, but did not find David. They promised to keep keep an eye on a restaurant in my house, but I could no longer work there because the thought of going back and seeing David terrified me. So I quit the next day. I changed my phone number, moved to a new apartment, and tried to start over, but even though I was no longer working at the restaurant, I couldn't help but feel unsafe everywhere I went. So a few months later, I went back to my hometown and stayed at my parents' house for a while. It was only from there that I started to feel safe again, and I was able to resume my life. Music. Normally, I was 25 years old when this happened. This was not my first night shift job, but it was the only one where I worked completely alone, and it would also be the last such job I would ever take in my life now. Before I share this story, let me tell you up front. I was not under the influence of any drugs, nor had I been drinking. Being completely honest, the reason I ended up living and working where I did was because I had just completed a detox and subsequent residential stay in a drug treatment program. So oddly enough, you could say I was as sober as possible. This was definitely not one of the best times of my life, but in the end, we live and are in from these moments anyway. Well enough dizzying you with my background. The thing is, I worked the night shift as a maintenance man at a large retirement community located in the city of Temple, Texas. In late 2011 that day, I arrived at 7 p.m. Like each day, my checkout was set for 6 a.m. The seniors were allowed to remain in the community building until 9 p.m. before returning to their individual apartments. There was a delightful 2-hour window in the community building filled with friendly, chatty older folks milling about, playing cards, engaging in conversation, and exercising. The warmth and welcoming nature of these individuals reminded me of my childhood visits to my grandparents. But this time it felt like being surrounded by 100 grandparents. This gathering of seniors during that 2-hour span became my favorite part of the day. But as the clock struck 9 p.m., everything shifted. There was a distinct shift in the energy of the place that remains etched in my memory. I observed this transformation with each passing moment as the clock neared 9 p.m. An uncomfortable sense of dread and anticipation would come over me. It was so heavy and palpable that I knew I would soon be isolated in that huge, silent building all alone, or at least it would seem in that way. I knew unconsciously that something was going on, but I always tried to ignore that feeling in the building. There were windows that covered almost the entire structure, and they overlooked the outside parking lot. This building was arranged in a kind of U-shape or horseshoe shape, whatever you want to call it. The thing is that due to its shape, from one hallway you could look across the parking lot and also see the other hallway, which constituted the other half of this. I do not know if you understand, but the truth is that in that stretch, I constantly used to see someone or something walking through the hallways. It was just strange at first. I kept thinking that surely it was just the blinds open in a certain way or the shadow of the surrounding trees that gave the illusion of a human form, but this was just an attempt to lie to myself, because deep down I knew that this was impossible. I encountered this figure practically every day. It was very strange because at first whenever I saw him, it was as if he was walking in my direction, but from the other hallway, and sometimes he seemed to imitate my movements, that is, if I moved to one side, he did too. If I was walking and suddenly stopped, he did too, and when I tried to get closer to see who or what he was, he just disappeared. But I knew it wasn't a shadow of me first, because of the distance I was at, and second, because there was no light, no beacon that could cast my shadow like that. Also, this kind of shadow moved at will, and when it imitated me, it was not an immediate movement, but a delayed one, like when you were a child and your friend wanted to annoy you by playing this silly imitation game in which he repeated everything you did and said something like that. I never succeeded in trying to figure it out or catch it. Most of the time I would see it and try to run over there, but it always slipped away, and there was literally nowhere for anyone to hide or go except forward or back down the hallway and past me. But I never found anyone, and that only served to heighten my suspicions that something very strange was going on inside this place, not necessarily something evil or threatening, but it was there, and I knew. I was there too, since this was not really a commercial establishment, but rather a collection of community buildings. As I said before, we employees, both during the day and during the evenings, did not have a proper break room. so we all used the building's cafeteria space, as well as the refrigerator, microwave, and coffee maker that were there, which were actually meant to be used by the elderly when it came time to have breakfast or their snacks throughout the day. I can't count the number of times I felt like having a quick pick-me-up coffee, or maybe a complimentary Jell-O, or snack, or a slice of cake. And that night was no exception. As it was close to midnight, I was craving a hot cup of coffee as it was getting a bit chilly. So I headed for the coffee shop, and as I rounded the corner before I go, in the area, a nurse from the hospice wing was also rounding the corner from her side of the complex, scaring the hell out of me. As I came face to face with her, just imagine being about 5 or 6 hours your shift, and you haven't seen or heard a single person's voice, or at least 3 or 4 hours, except step for that ghostly figure you can never seem to really locate, and suddenly, boom, you run face with someone totally unexpected. I was just short of letting out a high-pitched squeal like a scared little girl at the time. The nurse must have thought I was a freak, since upon seeing her I almost had a heart attack. I apologized to her and tried to say something funny regarding the encounter. She smiled at me too, and then another nurse caught up with her. I made the coffee and served them both. And for the next 5 or 10 minutes, we had a little friendly chat in the break area, or rather in the seniors' coffee bar that we used as a break area. These nurses kept coming in on several occasions during the night. This gave me the opportunity to at least have contact with other human beings during my night shift, which lowered my stress levels a bit. So over the following weeks and months, I got used to expecting someone to be in that break area at least once or twice during my long work shift. This helped me cope better with the overwhelming feeling of loneliness, as well as that other heavy unsettling feeling that settled into the atmosphere once the seniors returned to their rooms and I was left alone on shift. However, that new feeling of companionship that allowed me to be able to let my guard down and not constantly be a walking nervous wreck came to an end one night when I was in what I call the cul-de-sac, which ironically was actually the side of the U where the hallway ended in an office, a gym, and a physical therapy room, while on the other side of the U, I had a door that led to more empty rooms and offices. I must say that place had a special energy, as though you always felt as if something was behind you, watching you, stalking you. It was a very strong and very unsettling feeling. The worst part was having to slide a vacuum cleaner down there, because you constantly felt the need to turn around and check your back, as you couldn't rely on sounds to alert you. The thing is, one day I was cleaning the cul-de-sac, and other than that creepy feeling, everything was going pretty normal. Then something strange caught my attention. Through the window overlooking the back parking lot, there was a dimly lit sidewalk that bordered the building and led to a separate parking lot. This one was for employees only, and was in the back there, standing in the corner of that wall and almost trying to camouflage itself in the shadows, was a very tall, thin figure, half physical form, half part Eurytion, and very demonic looking. This figure was about 8 foot tall, but when you looked down at its feet, it simply vanished. It was not a full or solid figure until around the upper thigh. Its torso was bare, revealing misshapen ribs and a bluish-white skin color, much like a corpse. Its arms were extremely long, as were its hands, whose fingers ended in what looked like pointed claws and did not appear to be 5'5" but rather 3'4". I was completely paralyzed at the sight of him, bewildered, but also filled with terror. When I looked up into its face, I felt my heart freeze, for its face was that of a carav, but not a human one, but like that of a goat, but with long locks of hair falling to the sides, and its huge horns curled up. The creepiest thing, however, was that those empty sockets it had for eyes aimed to be staring straight at me. But it wasn't its hideous statue that terrified me the most. It was what I felt as its gaze drilled into me. The moment our gazes met, something happened that I still see unexplained today, and that is that the terror I felt was mixed with other feelings. Suddenly, an enormous feeling of emptiness and desolation began to invade me. I felt sad, desperate, and tormented. I felt an enormous desire to scream and cry, to get down on my knees. Images of my disastrous life began to flash through my head, filling me with anguish, despair, and sadness. My body was filled with overwhelming feelings: shame, pain, loss, despair. It was as if the most devastating feelings for a human being were crowding inside me at the same time, making me feel a torment that I had never experienced before in my life, and fortunately not afterwards. Either the experience was so intense that I felt nauseous, weak, my body was shaking, and before I knew it, I was crying my eyes out. At one point, I simply couldn't take it and looked away from him or whatever it was that was standing there. I felt oppressed, suffocated, and fell to the floor on my knees, my hands on my chest, trying to breathe through all the emotion. Turmoil inside me at that moment. I swear, I felt like I was going to die so much, so that I lay on the floor in a fetal position, hugging my legs to my chest, waiting for my heart to just stop beating. At one point, and honestly, with all the horrible things I was feeling, it really did seem like death was a lucky thing. I lay there on the floor in that position for I don't know how long, but when I finally had the strength to stand up, I looked out the window again in terror, but the figure was no longer there. It was gone, and fortunately, that was the first and last time I got to see it after that another job. But I didn't have that option at the time, so I kept working every night, feeling terrified of meeting that figure again. But there was something interesting about that entity, something I GHD about in the days that followed, and that is that the place where I was standing was a palliative care area, a place where we lost at least one person every 2 weeks. Basically, that's where terminally ill patients spend their last days. This made me think about the feelings that overwhelmed me that night when I looked that figure in the eye, and the reason why I was standing right there. My theory, it is that that entity was indeed a demon. I don't know anything about demonic entities. Maybe if any of you have knowledge about that, you will know how to explain it better or understand what it was about, or maybe you will know what kind of demon specifically it was. But I'm sure it was personally, I believe that this entity fed on all the negative feelings that could overwhelm these people who their lives slipping through their fingers, all those feelings of loss, desolation, sadness, total hopelessness, homesickness, emptiness, and fear. I am sure that this was the reason why I was there in ALS. That this entity was responsible for that oppressive feeling that was felt all over the place. When I was left alone, it was a couple more years before I was able to move and find another job. Indeed, during all that time, there was a latent fear inside me of meeting this being again. But as I said before, I had no other alternative. However, I tried as much as possible to relax by listening to music, talking to the nurses and the like, but it was not easy. I didn't tell anyone about it either, because I really didn't want to tell an old man who might eventually get his turn in palliative care that the was a demonic entity on the other side of the wall that would be cruel. So instead, I kept this experience to myself for many years until today, when I am sharing it with you. My name is Linda, and I am 23 years old. A couple of years ago, I got a job at a 24-hour grocery store. I was in college and just wanted some money to cover my 29:27. I managed my expenses while enjoying time with friends. My study schedule allowed for afternoons, making evenings ideal for socializing. After a few months at my job, I became familiar with the regulars. Most were pleasant or just typical patrons. However, there was one individual who stood out. He had an unsettling presence and always left me with an uneasy feeling. He usually showed up late at night, around 11 p.m. to midnight, and walk around the store for a long time before getting 1 or 2 cheap items and coming to the checkout. Whenever I arrived, I could always catch this man looking at me strangely on several signs. He was a guy of about 40 or 45, small and thin. He had long hair and an unkempt beard. He also had a very particular way of walking, kind of penguin-like, and in general, he was someone strange. He didn't give me any confidence. He never talked much, but I had assumed he lived on the street or in his car, and that would explain why he only bought things like chips and snacks. Also, the fact that his clothes were never clean, and he looked unkempt everywhere. Several weeks, if not months, went by, and the man kept coming in almost daily and doing the exact same thing all the time. So at one point I stopped thinking about it, as it was now a very normal part of my job. But one night he came in as usual, only instead of walking through the store, he went straight to the cash register. I asked him if he needed help with anything, and the man just looked at me for a second before asking me if I was the one driving the old Toyota that was in the parking lot. This seemed a little strange to me, as he knew that, but then I thought it must be obvious, as it was probably the only car that was there every day and in the same place. But on the other hand, I found it somewhat disturbing that this person would notice it, as that would mean he was more aware of me than I thought. However, I tried to shake off my paranoid thoughts and just told him yes, because I thought maybe it was that there was something wrong. With my car, but the man kept a straight face and walked away from the cash register without saying anything else. That was very strange. So I asked my coworker to watch the registers for a moment. And then I went to the front of the store and looked outside. I went into the parking lot, and my car was right where I had parked it, and there didn't seem to be anything wrong with it. I went back to register thinking I would ask the man about it when he came to pay, but he never did. I don't know when he left, but the store closed without him coming to the register like he always used to that night. When I left, I checked my whole car, and nothing seemed out of place. It left me just confused. The next day, I planned to ask him again, as I had actually been very intrigued by his question the night before. But the guy didn't come that day, or the next, or for the entire next month. The strange man seemed to have simply vanished, leaving me in doubt, but it wouldn't be long before I found out why he was so interested in knowing if the car was mine. One Monday at about 5 a.m. when it was still dark, I left work as usual. Sunday night was the only night of the week that I was alone at the register. So at the end of the day, I always left alone, but that early morning when I started walking across the parking lot to my car, I had a really strange feeling in my gut. Maybe I just remembered it wrong, or maybe there really was some intuition about something, but I remember feeling in that something was wrong from the moment I set foot outside the store. So I walked quickly and got into my car, looking around the parking lot nervously. It was practically empty, and I had nothing to give me reason to believe anything was wrong. But somehow I knew something was out of place. I started my car, and just before I put it in gear, I heard the tiniest sound right behind me. I looked out of the corner of my eye and saw something move in a mirror in front of my back seat. At that moment, I felt a chasm open up in my stomach. I immediately panicked and left the car running as I ran out to the store, alerting my 2-day shift coworkers who had just arrived. We stood behind the store window and watched for a while to see if anyone got out of the car. Meanwhile, my partner called the police. We didn't see anyone get out of the car during that whole time. When the officers arrived, my car was empty, and there was no sign of forced entry, so they assumed that the intruder must have had some legal copy of a key, or I must have accidentally left the door was unlocked. The thought of this gave me chills. I didn't know, which was worse, the fact that the intruder had a key to my car, or that had been lurking around for days or weeks, waiting for the moment I accidentally left my car doors open to sneak, and I didn't actually get to see the intruder in my car, but I'm pretty sure it was the man from weeks ago, and that was the reason I wanted to know which car was mine. It terrifies me to think that maybe he'd been trying to get in for the whole month that I hadn't seen him, and D was waiting for me to forget to lock the doors, although I think I locked them that night, but I'm not sure. Maybe he forgot, or worse, maybe he managed to get a duplicate. Either way, it's something I'll probably never know for sure, but I can't rule it out completely. Whoever it was, though, the man who was there clearly wasn't simply trying to steal the car, as he even tried to stay hidden after I got in and started it. It's horrible to know that I was so close to having left that parking lot and driven off with him in the back seat unknowingly. And once I would have gotten out of there, who knows what would have happened. Maybe he would have waited until I got in my house, or maybe he would have never made it home. It gives me chills just thinking about all the chances this person had that night to hurt me. After that incident, I really stopped feeling comfortable working at that place. The pay was good and the work environment was good, but just the thought that creepy man could still be out there talking me and waiting for the right moment to hurt me was just something I couldn't deal with. So less than a week later, I put in my resignation and waited a couple of months before getting another GHD music job. I have worked in a cemetery for the past 17 years. Most of those years, I have been on the typical night shift, which was from 11 p.m. until 7 a.m. In my mind, working at night had many more benefits than working during the day, since the daytime employees had more things to do. Since more people would visit the yard during the day, there would also be burials that would take place several times a week, which must be organized, and above all, during the whole process, the attendants must be in charge of preparing the grave, arranging the space where relatives will be, and then taking care of doing the burial work, a job that is quite tiresome. To tell the truth, the night shift, on the other hand, and gets paid an extra $2 an hour, and we don't have To do any of that, I must say that I have seen a lot during my years working the night shift at this place. Mostly horrors, more earthly than supernatural, from petty things like drunken teenagers daring each other to walk through the Campo Santo at night, to grave robbers trying to make off with corpses or with the possible belongings their relatives may have buried them with. I have also seen Praktidi, oneers of various dark cults, try and come to the cemetery to do witchcraft rituals and such things. However, what happened that night was completely different. I arrived at the small faculty building little early to chat with the day worker, and once he left, I performed all the normal checks and precautions that protocol indicates at the start of my shift. After that, my only job is really to drive round in a golf cart from time to time around the holy field, making sure nothing unusual happens. I'd say I only run into something once a month, or maybe even every other month anyway. The first EW hours were completely normal. I drove around a few times, then went back to the small faculty building for lunch, and I think it was around 2 a.m. When I went back out for another walk around the courtyard, when I got to the other end, I saw something by the fence. It was obviously very dark, so I couldn't see much more than the general shape of figure standing there. I got as close as I could, and saw now that it was a man who was standing on the outside of the fence facing me. I didn't want to confront him if I didn't have to, so I turned around and entered a small loop around the lot to see if he would try to jump the fence while I was gone. But when I returned after a few minutes, he was gone. I scanned the area briefly to make sure he didn't sneak in, but all seemed clear, so I continued my usual patrol. Going around the whole yard takes about 15 minutes, but sometimes I would go slower just to pass the time and make the day less boring. I was going the same way and decided to look again at the place where I saw the man. I really had nothing better to do anyway. I started driving there, and almost immediately I saw the man again. He was inside the yard on the gravel road. I approached again, but the man didn't move, so I got out of the golf cart and started walking towards him. He looked like a 40-year-old man. I stopped just a few feet away from him and said, "Sir, you can't be in here. I need to escort you out." But he didn't even turn his head to look at me. After a second, a slight wave of fear ran through me. After all, who was this man, and what was he doing in the cemetery at this time of night? It frightened me what a thief or a psychopath in full crisis could do, whichever way, when I was alone and unarmed, despite the unsettling feeling I was forming inside me. I insisted once again, "Sir, I need you to come with me." I reached out my hand gently to touch his shoulder, but as soon as I did, he whipped his head around and turned to look at him. This caught me off guard, and I took a step back. Then the man just stared into my eyes. He looked full of anger, and after a few seconds of us staring at each other in tense silence, the man turned and started walking away. "What the hell?" I said quietly. I went back to my golf cart, preparing to call the police, as I watched him walk down to the fence over it and continue walking away. I was relieved, but till terrified. I drove straight back to the college and went inside. It was a small one-room security building, but I felt much safer and calmer in there. I sat down and caught my breath. In all my years working at the cemetery, I had never been so scared. I really had a very unsettling feeling. I waited inside for a while, I'm not sure how long, until I heard a knock on the door. I jumped out of my chair and looked towards the door in fear. A few seconds later, they knocked again. These were aggressive knocks, not those of someone friendly who wants to ask something or what do I know? No, these were furious and repeated knocks. It seemed that whoever was on the other side wanted to break down the door. I looked around in search of something to defend myself with. As I was trapped there, I had nowhere, but the only thing I had on hand was a thermos of coffee. So I took it to use as a weapon of defense in case it was necessary. Meanwhile, I took the phone from the desk and dialed 911. I didn't know what I wanted or why I was here, but I wasn't going to risk everything to find out. The person kept banging on the door. You could hear it was fists and kicks, but with impressive force. It was something furious, almost as if that person was venting a lot of anger against that door, as if he wanted to beat it down. But he wasn't saying anything. There was no yelling, no insults, no "open the door for me," nothing like that. Just frantic banging, and for no apparent reason. I felt really scared, and while I didn't know who was on the other side, I was absolutely sure it was the same guy I had encountered a moment ago, and God knows what he wanted. But after probably about 5 or 10 minutes of continuous banging, I heard footsteps walking away. They could be heard clearly as there was gravel outside, and the footsteps were Chew. I'd audible, although I could no longer hear, and presumably he was gone. It wasn't until the police arrived that I opened the door. They searched the whole place, but found no one yet remained there for several hours. To prevent the assailant from returning the next day, my manager was able to pull up the building CCTV security footage, and what I saw was truly horrible just a few minutes after I entered the building. The man I had seen in the courtyard earlier approached the door, stood there silently for almost 15 minutes before he started banging on the door. Almost madly, the man was pounding with his arms, legs, and head. He was completely enraged and crazed. As I watched these horrific images, I felt a shiver run through my entire body. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened to me if Hatman had managed to get into the building. These images were given as evidence to the police, but the man was never identified from that day on. I requested permission to bring a weapon during my work day for safety. Fortunately, the company granted it. That was about 6 years ago, and to a job in the same cemetery, but I've never seen that guy. Music, again, I have been a registered nurse in a general hospital for about 3 years. It's one of the toughest jobs although it's also rewarding, as MYOB job is all about helping people at their most vulnerable times when their health is failing. I work in the intensive care area, so most of my patients are people in serious condition. So most of the time I would be caring for the patient and administering medication, but from time to time I also provide support in the emergency area. We have had several people come in late at night complaining of fibromyalgia and other common conditions that could easily be treated at home. I often deal with these types of people in the emergency area by simply giving them simple over-the-counter medications if they had insurance. However, there have been a few occasions when we have had to treat patients who why needed it, and in these cases, if the person is too insistent, sometimes placebos can be given. The thing is that treating patients not only makes you feel rewarded, but sometimes you also develop a bond with them. And this story has the same principle. Once I took care of an old man whose wife had just died, and he was admitted to the hospital for a severe bacterial infection. His name was Wayne, and he was the sweetest and gentlest grandfather ever. Taking care of Wayne more than an obligation for me. It was a pleasure. He generated a tenderness that I could not even explain. He was also very nice, cheerful, and always told us his life stories, and he really had a very interesting life. He also often talked about his deceased wife, how he met her, and how much he loved her when I had to take care of when the hours flew by. I really began to develop an emotional connection with him. He was also a great dog lover. He had 3 dogs at home, and every day he would show some concern for them and say he missed them so much and couldn't wait to get out of the hospital to go see them. This broke my heart a little bit because Wynn's condition was quite delicate and the hospital did not allow pets, so he would probably never see his dog again. As a nurse, it is our responsibility to be there, to be patient, and give emotional support to the patient if required, although this is something that not many nurses do, but I do. After all, someday, I will be on the other side, on the patient side, and I would like to receive from my nurse the same dignified and humane treatment that I try to get to my patients one day. Wayne Luke DM me almost in tears and thanked me for everything I had done for him. This surprised me completely and left me with a great tightness in my chest, best as I soon realized what those words meant. Wayne passed away a day later, and I cried for almost a week. The other nurses were sad, but not as sad as I was, as he was one of the people I really cared about, and when he was gone, I felt the grief as if I had lost someone very close. Weeks went by, and I just got over it. It often popped into my head from time, but I moved on, as this was something I had to get used to. One night, I was talking to any of my colleagues at the reception desk about a patient's medical history when she asked me to get a piece of equipment out of the basement. The basement of the hospital is where we usually keep our equipment and other medical supplies for storage. They are not common in most hospitals, but they do exist. It is very rare for one of us to go down to the basement, so this meant we needed something quick. Important. I took the elevator and pressed the basement level. As I turned on the lights, I had this somewhat creepy feeling. I've been in the basement many times, and I've never had a feeling like this. To best describe it, it felt like a feeling of dread coming from somewhere here. But I wasn't sure where. To be fair, basements are creepy in and of themselves, especially hospital basements. but this was T. The first time I experienced is that in this place, I was walking down this little hallway we have, and I grabbed the equipment that was sitting on one of the shelves, and at that moment, I could have swore. And I heard footsteps behind me. However, they didn't sound like the footsteps of someone wearing shoes. They sounded like the footsteps of a barefoot person walking on the tile. For a moment, I assumed it W. As one of my classmates trying to play a joke on me, this would not be unusual. We always played this kind of pranks on each other. So I thought I would catch them in the act and surprise them or whoever. But the surprise was mine. I left the room and went back to the main area, but saw no one. At some point, I shouted hello to everyone here. Don't strain yourself, guys. I saw you. I hadn't seen any. But that would bring down their little joke. However, I didn't get a response. I needed to leave quickly, so I didn't give them any thought and headed for the elevator. But at that moment, I heard loud and clear an old man's voice call my name. The voice echoed throughout the hallway. And yes, it was Wynn's voice. I stood frozen in place, my ears wide open, waiting to hear the voice again, and I didn't have tea. A few seconds later, I heard Wynn's voice calling my name again. Now, behind me, fighting the stiffness in my muscles and the panic that was taking over my being, I turned around to see who was behind me, and to my surprise, there was no one, just the empty hallway. I was now officially scared. I clutched the equipment in my arms and ran out down the hallway until I reached the elevator. I am media. Telly pressed the second floor, which was the area where I was to take the equipment, and after handing it to my friend, I drank a glass of hot coffee. Almost as if it was a shot, I was visibly upset. So my partner asked me what was wrong with me, but I really didn't want to tell her what had just happened because she probably wouldn't believe me or would think I was making up stories, but I didn't make up anything. That was completely real. Since that day, I have never gone down to the basement alone again, and I never heard Wayne again either. However, I kept him in my prayers for many days so that God would help him find his way to where he belongs now. During all these years, I've been a nurse. I've seen and experienced many things, but this was undoubtedly the most frightening of all. I hope your day is filled with health and joy. I invite you to subscribe to my channel to hear true horror stories. Hello, and see you again.